We'll go ahead and um, start the actual lecture for today, right? So let me open the notes. Okay, so this is Buddhism and Christianity, Lecture 6. We are covering um, Buddhism, the book Buddhism by Yandell and Netland, Chapter 4, Aspects of Buddhist Doctrine. So we have seen how Buddhism emerged in North India around the 6th century BC, then spread throughout Asia, and eventually was transmitted to the West in the 19th and 20th centuries. We have also given attention to the Buddhist teachings or doctrines. In this chapter, we will consider further the nature of doctrine or teaching in Buddhism, and we will conclude by examining again several major Buddhist teachings introduced in earlier chapters. Like all great religions, Buddhism not only calls for living a certain kind of life, but it also makes assertions about reality, the way things are. The Buddhist way of life is rooted in a particular understanding of what is real and what beliefs are true. Ancient Indian religious traditions often follow a pattern comparable to a medical analysis of an illness, moving from diagnosis, followed by an account of the causal conditions, and finally, consideration of cure and accompanying prescription. This structure is clearly reflected in the Four Noble Truths of early Buddhism. The medical analogy is a helpful way of looking at major religions, for each claims that there is a basic problem affecting humankind, as well as the whole universe, and each offers a distinctive way of overcoming this predicament while presuming that its diagnosis is correct and its cure is effective or efficacious. If we compare Christianity and Buddhism, for example, we see that quite different diagnoses and cures are offered by the two religions. In Christianity, the illness is sin caused by our misuse of the gift of freedom in an effort to become free from God. The disease is curable, and the cure requires God's gracious redemptive action in Jesus Christ, his life, his death for our sins, and his resurrection from the dead, and then our response and trust in God. In Buddhism, by contrast, the disease is the unsatisfactory nature of existing temporarily and dependently, caused by our mistaken belief that we are persons who endure through time. The disease is curable, and the cure requires the occurrence of a profound and esoteric or mysterious or secretive experience in which a calm lack of attachment is accompanied by deep acceptance of a Buddhist account of how things really are. Clearly, the diagnoses and cures in the two religions are different. The medical analogy also illustrates the utter seriousness with which devout believers in Christianity and Buddhism have taken the teachings of the respective religions. If you are ill, it is essential that you receive the correct medical diagnosis and begin appropriate treatment. This is a serious matter since mistakes in diagnosis or treatment can be fatal. Both Buddhism and Christianity assume that humankind is afflicted by a spiritual disease and in desperate need of a cure. But they disagree about the nature of the disease and on what will provide the cure. Let's talk about religious exclusivism. The seriousness with which believing Christians and Buddhists historically have treated these matters, combined with the conviction that their own perspective is true, results in the problem of conflicting truth claims and the tendency toward an exclusivism which insists that the diagnosis and cure offered in one's own religion is distinctively accurate and efficacious. That Christianity is exclusivistic in this sense is widely acknowledged and often criticized. For example, the Gospel of John records Jesus claiming to be the way, truth, and life, and that no one could come to God the Father except through him. That's a pretty famous verse Christians use to talk about Jesus being the only way. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Peter also asserted that salvation is found in no other name but that of Jesus. So, such themes in Christianity have been the subject of extensive debate in recent years and are often taken as evidence that Christianity is exclusive in ways that other religions, such as Buddhism, are not. At least that's the popular claim. But it is important to recognize that other major religions, including the Indian religions, also have exclusivistic tendencies in that each regards its own perspective as uniquely true and superior to other alternatives. Buddhism does not offer itself as merely one among many possible choices in the assortment of religious options. It claims to tell the truth about how things are and how best to deal with things being that way. Other accounts that are incompatible with Buddhist teachings are said to be mistaken, resulting in ignorance and further suffering. Only Buddhism leads to release from suffering and the ignorance from which suffering arises. Among the Indian religious traditions that were there were vigorous debates over rival religious claims. The Hindu teacher Shankara claimed that one could only be liberated by accepting his perspective, as expressed in Advaita Vedanta Hinduism. He dismissed the Buddha, arguing that his teachings were mutually contradictory, and stated that Buddha's doctrine has to be disregarded by those concerned for their own happiness. The scriptures of Jainism also state that only those who accept Jain doctrine can be enlightened and liberated from rebirths. Those who do not cannot be enlightened. One notable Buddhist text is equally exclusive in rejecting non-Buddhist teachings and stating that those who do not accept Buddhist doctrine will remain unenlightened. This should not merely be dismissed as an ancient perspective that modern Buddhists have outgrown. The Dalai Lama, for example, stated that true moksha, which means release from suffering, or nirvana, is only explained in the Buddhist scriptures and is achieved only through Buddhist practice. The theme is clear enough. Beliefs matter, and proper acceptance of the relevant teachings is essential for attending or attaining the goal of salvation. The stakes are high. To put the matter in Christian terms, there is a heaven to gain and a hell to avoid. There is only one way to gain heaven and avoid hell, but there are plenty of ways to avoid heaven and gain hell. Though such a perspective is deemed politically incorrect and is allegedly intolerant in the view of many today, it is, in fact, understandable if we actually examined what the religions claim. If one believes that these are the stakes, then taking seriously the idea that there is a path to take and many paths to avoid makes perfect sense. If a particular diagnosis of the spiritual disease is accurate, then we desperately need the efficacious cure. Now, a secularist who rejects not only Christianity and Buddhism, but other religions as well, will not think that there is any deep spiritual disease in need of cure, and thus will find the utter seriousness with which believing Christians and Buddhists take these matters to be, at best, error, if not simply superstitious ignorance, but simply to assume that the secular view is correct, and therefore to conclude that sincere Christians and Buddhists are intolerant for taking their respective views with such utter seriousness is a particular perspective which needs a sufficient reason. In addition, there is no reason to accept the suggestion that deep commitment to a particular view about the spiritual disease, whether Christian or Buddhist, is necessarily intolerant. Tolerance and intolerance concern the appropriate treatment of people whose beliefs or actions one does not fully accept, not the commitment to religious beliefs or rejecting of beliefs. Belief in a spiritual disease that requires a cure does not justify use of violence or any disrespectful means to induce others to accept one's views, nor does it sanction mistreatment of those with whom one disagrees. Buddhism and Christianity offer strikingly different diagnoses of the problem afflicting humankind and thus different cures. A basic Buddhist theme is that our most fundamental disease is a kind of ignorance that requires right understanding or knowledge. Buddhism promises enlightenment as the cure, whereas the Christian tradition offers answers. um, Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. The Buddhist tradition answers come to see how things really are and you will become enlightened. Let's turn to Buddhist doctrine and truth. It is popular today in the West to minimize the significance of doctrine or truth claims in religions and claim that what really matters is personal experience. Buddhism is held up as an example of a religion in which doctrines are merely pragmatic tools to prod one toward enlightenment. The minimizing of doctrine is evident in the discipline of religious studies as practiced in many Western universities. Religious studies tend to emphasize things that can be observed by those studying the religious tradition, the rites, ceremonies, architecture, formal and informal organizations, etc. Doctrines are not items that can be seen or heard. Their centrality to a religious tradition is thus often underestimated. Moreover, matters of doctrine tend to be in, under the charge of the community leaders or the religious elites, are in the charge of. Uh, so these factors are joined by some traits of Buddhism itself, which can be seen to reduce the significance of doctrine. For example, nirvana is said to be ineffable or beyond concepts and descriptions. As the idea of ineffability is stressed, nothing doctrinal concerning nirvana is stated. Mahayana Buddhism also puts forward the idea of skillful means, which claims that the Buddha taught different things to different people in accord with what they were able to understand. The suggestion is not that the Buddha was deceptive, but that people vary in their capacity to grasp the truth. One person might be able only to understand a distant approximation of a given doctrine. Another might manage a closer approximation, and only a few will grasp the full doctrine itself. This suggestion leads to thinking of Buddhism as teaching various levels of doctrine. Obviously, this raises a problem for interpreting Buddhist teachings. One has to figure out which version of teaching is the one that says how things really are. This issue arises frequently in the Buddhist tradition. The importance of where the deepest teaching lies is a matter of what doctrine one must believe in order to become enlightened. Finally, given the vast number of texts taken as authoritative by Buddhist traditions, a literal interpretation of all scriptures yields multiple inconsistencies. The common Western assumption that Indian, Chinese, and Japanese religious and philosophical traditions happily embrace acknowledged contradictions in religion or elsewhere is unwarranted. With some exceptions, Buddhist traditions, like other religious traditions, will want a reading of their authoritative texts that is logically consistent. But to arrive at such a reading, it is necessary to treat some passages as expressing the true doctrine and other passages as merely expressing the closest approximation to the true doctrine that the original audience could grasp. The distinction between the literal statements of true doctrine and non literal statements, and between exact statements and approximations, assumes that there are true doctrines that can be stated and thus does not provide evidence against there being such doctrine. Applying skillful means explanations of textual differences has the same presupposition as well as the consideration of significant differences in people's abilities to grasp doctrines. Moreover, the acceptance of the idea of rebirth removes much of the urgency of getting things right within this lifetime. Finally, the importance attached to consistency also argues for the idea that there are at least some important doctrines that can be stated. Now, it is certainly true that early Buddhism was not interested in abstract metaphysical speculation or doctrine merely for its own sake. Buddhist teachings are soteriological. Um, the word relates to salvation in Christian theology. So in this case, that's meaning they are intended to guide people toward enlightenment and liberation. The Buddha compared his teachings to a raft that is useful for getting to the other side of a river, that's symbolizing nirvana, after which it can be left at the shore. Moreover, the Buddha systematically discouraged speculative questions, which he believed were not conducive to attaining enlightenment. On one occasion, a disciple became dissatisfied with the Buddha's unwillingness to answer a series of metaphysical questions, such as whether or not the world is eternal, uh, the world is finite or infinite, the soul and body are identical or distinct, and whether or not one exists after death. When the disciple demanded answers, the Buddha responded by noting that he never promised answers to these questions and that demanding that they be answered before putting into practice the Buddha's teaching would mean one never attains enlightenment. The Buddha insisted that overcoming the causes of suffering, attaining enlightenment and nirvana, does not depend upon settling such questions. Rather than speculate about such matters, the Buddha kept the focus upon suffering and the elimination of suffering. It does not follow that no metaphysical questions are of ultimate religious importance, or that no metaphysical beliefs are required for reaching enlightenment. The understanding of Buddhist teaching as primarily pragmatic and conducive to attaining enlightenment, and the Buddha's reluctance to engage in metaphysical questions should not be taken as meaning that correct understanding or belief is not important in Buddhism. In the West, Buddhism is seen as primarily a matter of engaging in meditation practices that lead to certain mystical experiences or a set of therapeutic exercises resulting in calming experiences, and questions about doctrine or correct belief are minimized. But in classical Buddhism, rejecting certain incorrect beliefs and embracing certain correct beliefs is regarded as essential to overcoming the causes for suffering and rebirth. Contrary to popular perception, there is an intellectual or analytic component of meditation that consists in intense reflection upon basic categories of Buddhist doctrine and the application of them to the experience of meditation. An essential part of such analysis is the refutation of false views. The pragmatic emphasis in Buddhist views on doctrine should not be taken as indicating that Buddhism embraces a strictly pragmatic theory of truth. While the value of the Dharma is in its utility for gaining liberation, it does not cease to be true when this aim has been realized. Let's talk now about rebirth and karma. The Buddhist tradition tells a simple story which includes a doctrine of rebirth. Without any beginning, each of us has lived one embodied lifetime after another for countless ages. We have lived and died billions of times. Unless we become enlightened, we will continue to do so forever. Moreover, this is not a happy state of affairs. Rebirth brings with it suffering, pervasive dissatisfaction. Life within the cycle of rebirth is viewed as inherently undesirable. In Buddhism, life in this world is seen to be profoundly unsatisfactory. This theme is typically put in terms of life inevitably involving suffering. But this way of stating things can be misleading. The Pali term dukkha, which is used to describe pain and suffering, has a broader meaning in speaking of a pervasive unsatisfactoriness or discontent. Even the greatest joy is fleeting. Anxiety about one's place in the world, the purpose of living, the fear of altogether ceasing to exist, the uncertainty of the future, the inevitability of aging unless one dies young, the awareness of the ravages of war and disease, the ever present possibility of something terrible occurring to you and those you love. These compose a small part of the evils that threaten us all. The bottom line is that no good that you receive in this life completely fulfills your needs and hopes. And every good experienced in this life will be utterly lost. This is true of the present lifetime and of every other lifetime, unless you become enlightened. The Buddhist teaching is that you need an effective way of escaping the unsatisfactoriness of not just this life, but all lives. A doctrine of karma is also an integral part of the Buddhist account. The doctrine of karma claims that one's actions in this and all previous lives have consequences. If they are right actions, then the consequences will be relatively desirable. If they are wrong actions, then the consequences will be undesirable. Each right or wrong action has its own set of consequences, and there is no escaping them. Some of the consequences may come in the lifetime in which the action that leads to them is performed, but others do not. So when one's body dies, one still has consequences coming. Thus, one must be reborn in order to receive these consequences. But then in this new lifetime, one also performs actions and thereby initiates yet further consequences, which again are not exhausted within the lifetime. So again, one must die and be reborn in still different circumstances. So it goes forever unless something radical happens to break the cycle, namely the experience of enlightenment. If one approaches the story of beginningless birth and death, repeated over and over again, from a common sense viewpoint, or from a Christian or even a Jewish or Islamic perspective, one will likely understand it in terms of the travels of a soul from one life to another. But none of these traditions accepts these ideas. If one retains the idea of a soul and transfers it to the rebirth karma perspective, the resulting view is that there is a conscious being that is distinct from the body and exists without a beginning. It lives in one body after another. But no condition the enduring soul is ever in is actually satisfactory. Relief will come when the cycle of rebirths ceases. At that point, one's enduring soul will be in something like heaven or hell, or perhaps purgatory. One will not re enter the cycle of rebirths. While this type of teaching can be found in Hindu and Jain traditions, this is not the classical Buddhist perspective. The Buddhist perspective is quite different. There are various heavens or places of pleasant, although still unsatisfactory, afterlife, and also various horrifying hells. But none of these is permanent. Furthermore, according to Buddhist accounts, one can be reborn as a worm, a ghost, or a god or goddess. There are many other possibilities, and you have not always been a human being. In fact, in your extensive number of past existences, you have had the lives of an incredible number of beings. Let's pause for a moment right here.